Clara leaned in, and their lips met in a kiss that was slow, tender, and filled with an intensity that Lana hadn't felt in years. In that moment, everything else fell away. The guilt, the fear, the loneliness, and all that remained was the passion between them. Lana and Tom Miller, a couple who seemed to embody the idyllic life everyone envied. Married for 5 years, Tom was well regarded as a successful financier, while Lana, his beautiful and charming wife, was admired for her grace and kind demeanor. Inside their home, Lana and Tom shared the routines of married life. Tom was quiet, responsible, and loving. At least, that's how it appeared from the outside. But behind the closed doors, the reality was far more complicated. As the days passed, the smiles they wore in public faded into silence and distance within their walls. Tom's job kept him away for long hours, and when he was home, the intimacy they once shared had faded into the background, replaced by conversations that were mechanical and polite, as if they were merely roommates. It wasn't just the emotional distance that had driven them apart. There was a secret between them, one they never openly discussed, but always felt. Tom was impotent, a fact that had silently gnawed away at their marriage. They tried to act as if everything was normal, but deep down, Lana's desires had been left unfulfilled. Though she never voiced it, Lana had begun to feel isolated, longing for the touch and affection that Tom could no longer provide. She never blamed him, at least not at first. But over time, the growing gap between them started to stir something within her, a restlessness, a craving for more. Enter Clara. The moment Clara moved into the house next door, it was as if something shifted in the air. Lana first saw her while trimming roses in her garden, noticing the way Clara carried herself. Elegant yet elusive, with a hint of mystery. Clara was around Lana's age, but there was an undeniable magnetism about her. She wasn't like the other neighbors who smiled politely at block parties or gossiped over coffee. Clara was different. She was quiet, enigmatic, with an aura that suggested there was more beneath the surface. One rainy afternoon, when Tom had gone to work and the house felt unbearably quiet, Lana found herself gazing out the window at Clara's house. She remembered seeing Clara walk her dog earlier in the morning, her short dark hair slightly damp from the rain. Lana felt an urge to connect, to break the monotony of her loneliness. Grabbing her umbrella, she walked next door and knocked. Clara opened the door with a soft smile, her blue eyes piercing yet warm, and in that moment, Lana felt something stir inside her. "Hi, I'm Lana," from next door. "I thought I'd stop by and welcome you to the neighborhood," Lana said, trying to mask the nervous flutter in her chest. "Hi, Lana. I'm Clara," she responded, her voice smooth and inviting. "Why don't you come in? It's raining quite heavily." Lana hesitated only for a moment before stepping inside. The warmth of Clara's home enveloped her as they settled into a conversation that was surprisingly easy. Clara was different, open but with an air of secrecy. She told Lana about her love for art, how she had moved to the suburbs to find some peace, to escape the chaos of her previous life. They spoke for hours, and what started as small talk evolved into something deeper, a bond that formed quickly between them. From that day forward, Lana found herself drawn to Clara in ways she hadn't anticipated. Clara's home became a sanctuary, a place where she felt understood in ways she never had with Tom. They spent more and more time together. Afternoons turned into evenings, and evenings into late nights. Clara's presence filled the void that had grown in Lana's life. As the days passed, the bond between them deepened, transforming from friendship into something unspoken, something more intimate. Lana found herself thinking of Clara even when she wasn't with her, her mind replaying their conversations, their laughter, the subtle touches exchanged during a movie night or while cooking dinner. Lana's longing for affection, once dormant, now burned with a quiet intensity, and Clara responded to it in kind. One evening, While they were sitting on Clara's couch, sipping wine, the tension between them became too much to ignore. Clara reached out, gently tucking a strand of Lana's hair behind her ear. Lana's breath caught in her throat as Clara's hand lingered, her touch soft but electric. "You know you don't have to pretend with me," Clara whispered, her voice low and velvety. Lana's pulse quickened, her heart racing as she searched Clara's eyes. For a moment, she hesitated, torn between the loyalty she felt for Tom and the growing desire she couldn't deny. But the desire won. Clara leaned in, and their lips met in a kiss that was slow, tender, and filled with an intensity that Lana hadn't felt in years. In that moment, everything else fell away. The guilt, the fear, the loneliness, and all that remained was the passion between them. They spent the night together, wrapped in each other's arms, their bodies entwined as they explored the depths of their newfound connection. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual. For Lana, it was a real awakening. For Clara, it was a fulfillment of something she had always craved but had long hidden. But as the sun rose the next morning, reality came crashing down. Lana lay in Clara's bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of her actions settling in. She had betrayed Tom, the man who had loved her, the man who had given her a life that many envied. Guilt gnawed at her, but alongside it was a sense of liberation. With Clara, she had found something she hadn't known she was missing. As the weeks passed, Lana and Clara's affair deepened. They stole moments together whenever they could, sneaking around while Tom was at work, lying to friends and neighbors about where Lana was spending her time. But with every stolen moment, the tension grew. Lana became more distant from Tom, her lies becoming more elaborate as she tried to maintain the facade of a happy marriage while indulging in her secret life with Clara. Tom wasn't oblivious. He noticed the way Lana had changed, the way she smiled less, the way her phone was always out of reach, the way she avoided his touch. At first, he tried to dismiss it, convincing himself that it was just a rough patch, that they would find their way back to each other. But as time went on, his suspicions grew. He began watching her more closely, noticing the subtle changes in her behavior. He started checking her phone when she wasn't looking, reading through her messages, trying to find any clue that would explain the growing distance between them. One evening, while Lana was in the shower, Tom found a message from Clara on her phone. The message was simple, just a heart emoji and the words, "I miss you," but it was enough to confirm what Tom had been dreading. His heart sank as he realized that his worst fear had come true. Lana was having an affair. Tom's world shattered as he stared at the message on Lana's phone. The truth stared back at him, undeniable and cruel. His hands trembled and his chest tightened as a whirlwind of emotions surged inside him. Anger, betrayal, disbelief. For a long moment, he couldn't move, his mind replaying every interaction he'd had with Lana over the past few months, trying to understand how it had come to this. He had known something was wrong, but he had never expected this. He had never imagined that his wife, the woman he loved, could betray him with someone else, let alone with another woman. Tom stood frozen, still holding Lana's phone, until the sound of the water shutting off in the bathroom broke his trance. Panic set in. He quickly placed the phone back where he found it and sat on the edge of the bed, his heart pounding in his chest. Lana emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, her hair still damp. She smiled at him, but it didn't reach her eyes. Tom looked at her, wondering how long she had been lying to him, how long she had been sneaking away to be with Clara. His mind was racing with questions, but he knew now wasn't the time to confront her. He had to be sure. He had to know everything before he could confront her. And so, for the first time in their marriage, Tom kept his suspicions to himself, pretending that everything was fine, all the while planning his next move. Meanwhile, Lana's affair with Clara only grew stronger. What had started as a secret passion quickly turned into something deeper, something that neither woman had expected. Lana found herself falling in love with Clara, not just for the physical connection they shared, but for the emotional intimacy that had developed between them. Clara understood her in a way that Tom never could. With Clara, there were no expectations, no judgment, just the freedom to be herself. Clara, too, had fallen for Lana. For years, Clara had kept her sexuality hidden, afraid of what people would say, afraid of being judged by a society that didn't accept who she truly was. But with Lana, she felt free. She felt seen. Their love blossomed in the shadows, hidden from the world, but no less real for it. One evening, as they lay together in Clara's bed, Lana turned to Clara, her fingers tracing the outline of Clara's jawline. "Do you ever think about what would happen if we didn't have to hide anymore?" Lana asked softly. Clara sighed, her eyes distant. "Every day. But we both know that can't happen. Not here. Not with your husband." Lana bit her lip, her mind racing with possibilities. She had thought about it before, what it would be like to leave Tom, to start a new life with Clara. But the thought scared her. Tom wasn't just her husband. He was her security, her stability. Leaving him would mean giving up everything she knew, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for that. "I just wish things were different," Lana whispered, her voice tinged with sadness. Clara leaned in, pressing her lips to Lana's forehead. Maybe one day they will be. While Lana and Clara continued their affair in secret, Tom's obsession with uncovering the truth grew. He began paying more attention to Lana's movements, when she left the house, where she went, how long she stayed. He started asking their neighbors if they had noticed anything unusual, casually bringing up Lana's frequent visits to Clara's house in conversation. The neighbors, always eager for gossip, were more than happy to indulge Tom's curiosity. They had noticed Lana spending more and more time at Clara's house, sometimes staying late into the night. Whispers of their affair had already started circulating, though no one dared to say anything to Tom directly. But the more Tom heard, the more convinced he became that something was happening behind his back. He even followed Lana on a few occasions, watching from a distance as she entered Clara's house, staying for hours before finally emerging, her face flushed with excitement. Each time he saw them together, his heart broke a little more. The anger inside him grew, festering like a wound that wouldn't heal. He couldn't understand why this was happening, why Lana would turn to someone else when he had given her everything. He blamed himself in part. He knew that his impotence had put a strain on their marriage, but he had never thought that Lana would seek comfort in the arms of another woman. Desperate to confront her, but unsure of how to do it, Tom began documenting everything he found. He took notes on Lana's behavior, gathered screenshots of her messages with Clara, and even began recording their phone conversations. He didn't know what he was going to do with the information yet, but he knew he needed it. He needed proof, something undeniable that would force Lana to admit the truth. But the deeper Tom dug, the more unstable he became. He stopped sleeping, his mind consumed with thoughts of Lana and Clara. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined them together, their bodies entwined in a way that he and Lana never were anymore. The jealousy ate away at him, turning his love for Lana into something darker, something dangerous. The breaking point came one evening when Tom couldn't take it anymore. Lana had just returned from another late night at Clara's house, her eyes bright with excitement, her face flushed with the glow of someone who had just spent time with the person they loved. Tom watched her as she entered the house, his anger boiling just beneath the surface. He had waited long enough. "Where have you been?" Tom's voice was calm, too calm, as he stood in the doorway of the living room, his arms crossed over his chest. Lana froze, her hands still on the doorknob. She had been expecting this moment for weeks, but now that it had arrived, her heart pounded in her chest. She forced a smile, trying to act casual. "I was just at Clara's," she said, her voice light. "We were..." Don't lie to me, Lana. Tom's voice was low, dangerous. He stepped toward her, his eyes burning with an intensity she had never seen before. I know about you and Clara. I know everything. Lana's heart skipped a beat. She felt the blood drain from her face as she stared at Tom, her mind racing. How much did he know? How long had he known? Panic set in as she tried to come up with an explanation, but there was nothing she could say that would make this better. Tom, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom took another step toward her, his fists clenched at his sides. How long, Lana? How long have you been sleeping with her? Lana's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen Tom like this before. He was always so calm, so composed, but now there was a wildness in his eyes that frightened her. She backed away, trying to put some distance between them, but Tom followed her, his voice growing louder with each step. I gave you everything, Lana. I loved you, and this is how you repay me? By sneaking around with our neighbor. Lana's back hit the wall, and she had nowhere left to go. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at Tom, her chest tight with guilt and fear. I'm sorry, Tom, she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't mean for this to happen. Tom's face twisted with rage. Didn't mean for it to happen? You've been lying to me for months. You've been sneaking off to be with her while I've been sitting here, trying to figure out what went wrong with us. Lana felt a sob rising in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She couldn't show weakness now. She had to stay strong, had to find a way to make him understand. But before she could say anything, Tom let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. I can't believe this, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. I thought we had something real, Lana. I thought you loved me. Lana's heart shattered at the pain in his voice. She had loved him once. She still did, in a way. But things had changed. She had changed, and there was no going back now. Tom, I'm sorry, she said again, her voice trembling. But I can't pretend anymore. I love Clara. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Tom stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without warning, Tom turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Lana stood there, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face. She had finally said it, the truth she had been hiding for so long. But instead of feeling relief, all she felt was emptiness. The days following Tom's explosive confrontation with Lana were heavy with silence, a suffocating tension that filled the once peaceful home. Tom had stormed out that night, disappearing without a word, and when he returned the next morning, there was no trace of the rage that had consumed him. But that was perhaps more frightening for Lana. He was calm now, eerily so, moving through the house as if nothing had happened, but his silence was laden with an unspoken menace. Every glance he gave her felt like the calm before the storm. Lana, on the other hand, was drowning in guilt and fear. She hadn't heard from Clara since that night, and the weight of her betrayal hung over her like a dark cloud. She had never intended to hurt Tom, and yet here she was, caught between the man she had promised to love and the woman who had awakened something in her she could no longer deny. Her feelings for Clara were real, but so was the devastation she had caused. Tom had become a stranger. He didn't lash out, didn't demand answers anymore. Instead, he watched her, his eyes following her every move with a cold, calculating gaze. He had withdrawn into himself, his mind obsessing over the betrayal, trying to make sense of it, but he couldn't. The more he thought about it, the more his anger grew, festering into something darker, something dangerous. He began to distance himself from Lana, spending longer hours at work and coming home late. But even when he wasn't there, Lana could feel his presence, like a shadow looming over her, always watching. She tried to reach out to Clara, but Clara had become distant, too, their once passionate affair now strained by the weight of what they had done. Lana found herself alone, caught between two worlds, neither of which she could fully claim as her own. But while Lana wrestled with her guilt, Tom's mind was focused on one thing: revenge. He couldn't let this betrayal go unanswered. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just Lana's fault. Clara had seduced her, had taken advantage of her loneliness, had wormed her way into their marriage like a snake. And Tom knew what he had to do. He began quietly gathering information about Clara. He followed her, watched her every move, learning her habits, her routines. He became obsessed with her, driven by a need to understand the woman who had stolen his wife from him. He followed her to work, to the grocery store, even to the coffee shop where she liked to sit and read. He studied her, waiting for the right moment to strike. One evening, after spending hours parked outside Clara's house, Tom decided it was time to take action. He waited until the lights went out, then slipped out of his car and approached her house. His heart pounded in his chest as he crept around to the back, his mind racing with a mixture of fear and excitement. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he knew he needed answers. He found a way into Clara's house through a window she had left cracked open. His hands trembled as he pushed it open and slipped inside, his feet barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. The house was dark, silent, and for a moment, Tom considered turning back. But the anger inside him was too strong. He couldn't walk away now. As he moved through the house, he heard a noise, footsteps coming from upstairs. His heart raced, and for a moment, he thought Clara might have heard him. But the footsteps moved away, and Tom continued his search. He made his way into the living room, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of Lana. His hands clenched into fists as he saw photos of Clara and Lana together, their smiles wide, their arms wrapped around each other. It was more than he could take. He grabbed the frame, his fingers tightening around it until the glass shattered in his hand. The sound was loud, too loud, and Tom froze. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, he heard Clara's voice from upstairs calling out, "Who's there?" Tom's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced, but before he could move, Clara appeared at the top of the stairs. Her eyes widened in shock as she saw Tom standing in the living room, his hand bleeding from the broken glass. "Tom, what are you doing here?" Her voice was laced with fear, but there was also defiance in her eyes. She wasn't afraid of him. That only made Tom angrier. He stood there, staring at her, his chest heaving with anger, but he didn't say a word. Clara took a step toward him, her eyes narrowing. "You need to leave. Now." But Tom didn't move. He couldn't. All the anger, all the pain he had been holding inside, finally exploded. He lunged at Clara, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her down the stairs. She screamed, trying to fight him off, but Tom was stronger. He dragged her into the living room, throwing her to the floor. "Do you think you can just take my wife and get away with it?" Tom's voice was a low growl, his body shaking with rage. "Do you think I'm just going to sit back and watch while you destroy everything I've worked for?" Clara struggled to get up, her eyes wide with fear. "Tom, please, you don't have to do this." But Tom didn't listen. He grabbed her by the throat, his fingers tightening around her neck. Clara's hands clawed at his, trying to pry them off, but it was no use. Tom was too strong, too consumed by his rage. For a moment, everything went quiet. Tom's grip loosened, and Clara gasped for air, her body trembling beneath him. But then, in a sudden burst of strength, she kicked him, sending him stumbling backward. Clara scrambled to her feet, her eyes wild with fear. She grabbed a nearby lamp, holding it out in front of her like a weapon. "Stay away from me," she hissed, her voice shaking. Tom stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes locked on Clara. His mind was racing, trying to decide what to do next. He could feel the blood on his hand, the sting of the glass, but the pain didn't register. All he could think about was Lana, his wife, the woman who had betrayed him. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps outside broke the tension. Tom and Clara both froze, their eyes darting to the window. Someone was approaching the house. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she realized who it was. Lana. Tom's face twisted into a dark smile. Perfect timing, he muttered under his breath. Before Clara could react, Tom lunged at her again, this time grabbing her by the hair and pulling her toward the front door. Clara screamed, but Tom's hand clamped over her mouth, silencing her. He dragged her to the door, his grip tightening as he opened it, revealing Lana standing on the porch, her eyes wide with shock. "Tom, what are you doing?" Lana's voice was trembling, her face pale as she took in the scene in front of her. Tom shoved Clara forward, sending her stumbling into Lana's arms. "Ask her," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Ask her what she's done." Lana looked at Clara, her heart breaking at the sight of the woman she loved, bruised and terrified. She didn't know what to do, didn't know how to make sense of any of it. All she knew was that she had to get Clara out of there. She turned to Tom, her eyes pleading. "Tom, please let her go. This isn't her fault. It's mine." Tom's face twisted with anger. "You think I care whose fault it is? You both betrayed me. You both deserve to pay for this." Lana's heart raced as she stepped between Tom and Clara, her body shaking with fear. She had never seen Tom like this before, so full of rage, so out of control. She didn't know what he was capable of, and that terrified her. "Please, Tom," she begged, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't do this." But Tom didn't listen. His mind was too far gone, consumed by the need for revenge. He stepped toward Lana, his hand reaching for her. But before he could touch her, Clara sprang into action. She grabbed the broken glass from the picture frame and slashed it across Tom's arm, causing him to cry out in pain. Tom staggered backward, clutching his arm, blood dripping from the wound. His eyes blazed with fury as he looked at Clara, his chest heaving with anger. "You'll pay for that," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. But Clara wasn't afraid anymore. She stood tall, her eyes locked on Tom's, ready to fight for her life and for Lana's. As Clara stood there, staring down Tom, Lana felt the weight of everything crashing down on her. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a fight for survival. She knew Tom wouldn't stop until he had destroyed everything. Her, Clara, their love. And in that moment, a dark thought entered her mind. They had to get rid of him. The thought was terrifying, but the more Lana considered it, the more it made sense. Tom wasn't going to let them go. He wasn't going to let them live in peace. The only way to end this was to end him. Lana turned to Clara, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We have to stop him, Clara. For good." Clara's eyes widened as she realized what Lana was suggesting. She looked at Tom, who was still clutching his bleeding arm, his eyes filled with hatred. There was no other way. Without a word, Clara nodded. It was time to end this nightmare. The plan was simple, but brutal. They would wait for Tom to return home, lure him into a false sense of security, and then they would strike. But murder wasn't easy, and as the night wore on, the weight of what they were about to do hung heavy over them. Tom returned later that night, his arm bandaged, but his anger still simmering just below the surface. Lana greeted him with a forced smile, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never imagined herself capable of such a thing, but now there was no turning back. Clara was waiting in the shadows, her hand gripping the handle of a kitchen knife, her mind racing with fear and adrenaline. They had planned everything down to the last detail, but now that the moment had arrived, it felt surreal. Tom didn't suspect a thing. He had calmed down, convinced that he had won, that Lana and Clara were too scared to fight back. He had no idea what was coming. And then in one swift motion, Clara stepped out of the shadows, the knife gleaming in the dim light. Tom turned, his eyes widening in shock, but it was too late. Clara plunged the knife into his chest, the force of the blow sending him staggering backward. Lana watched in horror as Tom collapsed to the floor, his eyes wide with shock, his hands clutching at the wound in his chest. Blood pooled around him, staining the carpet a deep red. He gasped for air, his body convulsing as the life drained out of him. It was over, but as the adrenaline wore off, the reality of what they had done set in. Tom was dead, and they had killed him. Clara stood over the body, her hands shaking, the knife still in her grip. Lana was frozen, unable to move, her mind reeling with shock and guilt. They had done what they had to do, but now what came next? Clara looked at Lana, her eyes filled with fear. What do we do now? Lana's mind raced as she tried to come up with a plan. They couldn't call the police, not after what they had done. They would be arrested, their lives destroyed. There was only one option. We have to get rid of the body, Lana whispered, her voice shaking. We can't let anyone find out. The house was eerily silent, the air thick with the stench of blood and fear. Tom's lifeless body lay sprawled on the living room floor, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. The blood had stopped pooling, already soaking into the carpet beneath him. Clara stood frozen, knife still clutched in her trembling hand, while Lana stared at the scene in disbelief. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of what they had done settled around them like a suffocating blanket. The adrenaline that had propelled them through the murder was gone, leaving only a sickening sense of dread in its wake. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. Lana was the first to break the silence, her voice barely a whisper. What have we done? Clara didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mind was racing, but every thought seemed to collide with another, making it impossible to think clearly. She had killed a man, and even though that man had been dangerous, filled with rage, it didn't change the fact that his blood was on her hands. And Lana's too. We have to get rid of him, Lana continued, her voice trembling. No one can find out. Clara nodded slowly, still staring down at Tom's body. She knew Lana was right, but the idea of moving him, of trying to hide the murder, was overwhelming. They hadn't planned for this. Not really. They had acted out of desperation, out of fear, and now they had to deal with the consequences. But there was no time to think. They had to move quickly. Lana knelt down beside Tom's body, her hands shaking as she reached for his lifeless arm. "Help me," she whispered to Clara, her eyes pleading. "We need to get him out of here." Clara swallowed hard, forcing herself to move. She dropped the knife onto the floor with a soft thud and stepped forward to help Lana. Together, they dragged Tom's heavy body across the floor, struggling with the dead weight. Every inch they moved him felt like a mile, and the sound of his lifeless limbs dragging across the floor made their stomachs churn. They had to get him out of the house. That was their only focus now. After what felt like an eternity, they managed to haul Tom's body into the garage. Lana fumbled with the keys to his car, her fingers slick with sweat, until she finally got the door open. They heaved his body into the trunk, the dead weight making their arms ache, and slammed the lid shut. The sound echoed through the garage, sending a shiver down their spines. Clara leaned against the car, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lana wiped her hands on her jeans, smearing Tom's blood across the fabric. "We drive out to the woods. We bury him. No one will ever find him." Clara nodded, though the thought of burying a body, of digging a grave in the dead of night, was almost too much for her to comprehend. But what choice did they have? If they didn't act now, they would be caught. And if they were caught, their lives were over. Without another word, Lana climbed into the driver's seat of Tom's car, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Clara got into the passenger seat beside her, and they drove into the night, the weight of their crime pressing down on them with every mile they traveled. The road stretched out in front of them, dark and endless. Neither of them spoke, the silence between them thick with tension and fear. Clara stared out the window, her mind racing. They had done the unthinkable, and now they were driving into the unknown, their futures hanging in the balance. They reached the outskirts of town, where the woods were dense and isolated. It was the perfect place to hide a body. No one came out here, and even if they did, the chances of them stumbling upon a shallow grave were slim. Still, Clara's stomach churned at the thought of what they were about to do. Lana pulled the car off the road, driving into the woods until they were deep enough that the road was no longer visible. She killed the engine, and for a moment, they just sat there in the dark, the silence deafening. "We have to do this quickly," Lana said, her voice strained. Clara nodded, though her body felt like it was made of lead. She didn't want to move, didn't want to face what they had to do next, but she had no choice. They both got out of the car and walked to the trunk, their footsteps crunching on the dry leaves beneath them. Lana opened the trunk, and the sight of Tom's body made Clara's stomach lurch. It was real. He was dead. They had killed him, and now they had to bury him like he was nothing more than a piece of trash. They grabbed the shovel they had brought from the garage and began digging. The ground was hard and rocky, and every shovelful of dirt felt like an eternity. Sweat poured down their faces, mixing with the dirt and grime, but they kept going, driven by fear and desperation. Finally, after what felt like hours, they had dug a hole deep enough to bury Tom. They dragged his body out of the trunk and lowered him into the grave, the weight of him pulling them down with him. As they stood over the body, the finality of what they had done hit them like a freight train. Lana was the first to move. She grabbed the shovel and began covering Tom's body with dirt, her movements mechanical, her mind numb. Clara joined her, the two of them working in silence until the grave was filled. When it was done, they stood there, staring at the freshly turned earth, the reality of their crime sinking in. There was no going back now. They had buried their sins, but the weight of them would follow them for the rest of their lives. The next morning, the weight of their crime felt even heavier. Lana and Clara tried to go about their lives as normally as possible, but every moment felt like they were walking on a tightrope, teetering on the edge of disaster. It didn't take long for people to notice Tom's absence. His co-workers grew concerned when he didn't show up for work, and after a few days, they called the police. A missing persons report was filed, and the investigation began. At first, Lana and Clara thought they could handle it. They stuck to their story. Tom had left after a fight, and they hadn't heard from him since. But as the days passed, the pressure began to mount. The police were thorough, and they had questions that Lana and Clara struggled to answer. The stress was unbearable. Every knock at the door, every phone call, felt like it could be the moment everything came crashing down. Clara began to unravel, the guilt eating away at her. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything other than Tom's lifeless body in that shallow grave. Lana tried to stay strong, tried to keep Clara calm, but she was crumbling too. The guilt was too much. Every time she looked at Clara, she saw the blood on both their hands. They had thought they could escape this, but the truth was it would haunt them forever. As the investigation closed in, something unexpected happened. Clara disappeared. One morning, Lana woke up to find Clara gone. Her clothes, her belongings, everything was missing. She had left without a word, without any explanation. Lana searched everywhere, but there was no sign of her. It was as if Clara had vanished into thin air. Lana was devastated. She had thought they were in this together, but now she was alone, And with Clara gone, the police's suspicion turned to her. They questioned her relentlessly, probing every detail of her story, looking for cracks. Lana did her best to hold it together, but without Clara, she felt like she was sinking. And then, the truth came out. One night, the police showed up at Lana's door with a warrant. They had found something that tied her to Tom's disappearance. Lana's heart raced as they searched the house, tearing it apart. She didn't know what they were looking for, but she knew it was only a matter of time before they found the truth. And they did. In the garage, hidden among Tom's belongings, the police found a small box. Inside was the knife, Clara's knife, the one they had used to kill Tom, the one they had thought they had gotten rid of. Lana's blood ran cold as she realized what had happened. Clara hadn't run away out of fear. She had run away to save herself, and she had left the knife behind to frame Lana. Lana was arrested that night, charged with Tom's murder. She tried to explain, tried to tell them about Clara, but no one believed her. Clara had vanished without a trace, leaving Lana to take the fall for everything. In the end, Lana was convicted of Tom's murder. She was sentenced to life in prison, her future destroyed, and Clara was never found. The truth of what happened that night in the woods would remain a mystery, known only to Lana and the woman who had betrayed her. As Lana sat in her prison cell, she couldn't help but wonder if Clara was out there somewhere, living a new life, free from the weight of their crime. Or maybe she was hiding, haunted by the same guilt that plagued Lana every day. Either way, the truth was out there, but it would never set her free.